There is a rule about silence. Not the kind you write down. The kind they tell you on the second day, when you've stopped asking questions about the first. When the woods go silent, you do not go outside. You do not look out the windows. You do not answer the radio, even if it uses your name. You stay where you are, and you wait for the wind to come back. I want you to understand something before I tell you anything else. The wind in that part of Alaska never stops. Not in autumn, not in the deep of winter, not at 3 in the morning when the dark is so total you forget the sun was ever a real thing. The wind is always there, scraping at the metal siding, humming through the antenna cables, pushing snow against the door in long dry hisses. So when it stops, when it truly stops, the absence of it is the loudest thing you will ever hear. The first time the woods went silent, I was alone in the control room at 4:12 in the morning. I know the time because I just logged a barometric reading. I remember my pen was still on the paper. And then every sound in the world simply switched off, the way a held breath stops, and I felt the pressure in my ears change, like the whole station had been lowered underwater. And in that silence, from somewhere out past the equipment shed, past the fence line, past the place where the snow met the black wall of the trees, something took a step. One step. Heavy. Deliberate. Closer than the trees should have allowed. And then a voice came over the radio. A voice I knew. A voice that had no business being on that frequency, because the man it belonged to had driven out 3 weeks earlier and never been replaced. It said my name. And then it said, "You can let me in now. I'm so cold." I did not let him in. That's the only reason I'm able to tell you this. This is what happened at Station Kelvin 9, in the months before they closed it, before they pulled the equipment, before they scrubbed it off the maps it was never really on. I've written it down the way I remember it. I want to be honest with you about that word, remember, because by the end, I'm not sure my memory is something you should trust. I'm not sure it's something I should trust either. But I'll tell you anyway. From the beginning. The job posting didn't call it a weather station. It called it a remote atmospheric monitoring facility, which is the kind of phrase that sounds like nothing, which I now understand was the point. I'd been out of work for 8 months. I had a meteorology degree I'd mostly stopped using, a lease I couldn't afford, and a particular talent for being alone that I'd convinced myself was a strength rather than a symptom. The listing wanted someone with cold weather experience, a clean record, and comfort with extended isolation. The pay was almost insulting in how good it was. 3 months on, 1 month off. Room and board included. No phone signal, they warned, in the same casual tone you'd used to mention the coffee was free. I should have asked why the pay was so high. I told myself it was the isolation. People will pay a lot to make someone disappear into the dark for a season. The interview happened over a landline. A man named Halvorsen asked me 4 questions about my background and one question that I didn't think about until much later. He asked, "How is your memory? Do you ever lose track of time?" I said no. I said I had a good memory. He made a small sound, like he was writing something down, and said that was fine. Said it like it was a normal thing to ask. They flew me into Dead Horse, and from there a man in a heated pickup drove me 4 hours north and west, off the Hall Road, onto a track that wasn't on the GPS. The driver didn't talk. The land outside flattened into something that stopped being land and became a concept. White going to gray going to a horizon you couldn't actually see, because the white of the ground and the white of the sky were the same color, and the line between them was a thing your eyes invented because they needed it to be there. There were no trees for the first 3 hours. Then, near the end, there were. That surprised me. This is the high Arctic. You're well north of the tree line. There shouldn't be a forest up there at all. But about 20 minutes before we arrived, a dark mass resolved on the western horizon, and as we got closer I saw it was trees, black spruce, stunted and dense, packed together in a way that didn't look natural, that looked planted, a thick band of forest sitting in the middle of treeless tundra like something had been drawn around it. I asked the driver about it. First thing I'd said in an hour. He didn't take his eyes off the track. He said, "You don't go in the woods, And that was all. Not a warning, exactly. Just a fact, stated the way you tell someone the stove is hot. Station Kelvin 9 sat at the edge of those woods. A low cluster of prefab buildings, weathered to the color of old bone, connected by enclosed walkways so you could move between them without going outside. A radar dome. A field of antenna masts. An equipment shed, a generator house, a fuel depot. And a tower, taller than anything else, taller than it needed to be for weather work, with a platform near the top and instruments I didn't recognize. Everything pointed at the sky. Except the tower platform. The tower platform pointed at the woods. There were 4 other people there when I arrived. There was Marsh, the station chief, a heavy, quiet man in his 60s who'd been there, by his own account, long enough. There was Petrova, the senior technician, sharp and tired, who ran the equipment and didn't waste words. There was Dunmore, the comms operator, younger than me, jumpy, who chewed the skin around his thumbnails. And there was Aoki, who maintained the generators and the fuel and the physical guts of the place, and who was the only one who smiled when I came in. 5 people. A station built for far more. Aoki showed me to my room and ran through the basics. Meals in the mess at set times. Water rationed in winter when the heater strained. Don't waste fuel. Don't prop the airlock doors. The shift schedule rotated so the control room was always manned, always, no exceptions, even when there was nothing to monitor. Then he handed me a laminated card, the kind you'd see in an airplane seat back. It was titled Station Procedures. There were 11 rules. Most of them were ordinary. Log readings every hour. Maintain core temperature in the equipment rooms. Report fuel levels daily. Don't operate the tower platform alone. But some of them weren't ordinary, and I read those twice. Rule number 3. When the woods go silent, all personnel remain indoors. Do not observe. Do not respond to external audio. Await wind return before resuming exterior activity. Rule number 7. Storms designated Class G are not to be logged in the public record. Refer all Class G observations to the station chief. Do not relay Class G data on open frequencies. Rule number 9. Personnel experiencing memory discontinuity should report to the station chief. Do not attempt to reconstruct missing time. I read them and I waited for someone to laugh. Aoki watched my face while I read, and when I looked up, he just said, "You'll get used to it. Everybody thinks they won't." "What's Class G?" I asked. "Marsh handles those," he said. "You won't see one for a while, probably. Just, when you do, you'll know. And you'll do what the card says." "And Rule 3? His smile faltered for the first time. "Just slightly. The woods don't go quiet often. When they do, you'll understand why there's a rule." He picked up my empty duffel and folded it. "It's a good job. It really is. The trick is to not think too hard about the parts that don't make sense. They make sense. Just not in a way that helps you sleep." He left me there, in a small warm room with a narrow bed and a window I couldn't see anything out of, because it was already dark, and it would be dark, more or less, for most of the time I was there. The first weeks were exactly what the job had promised. Repetition. Procedure. The slow grinding rhythm of a place where nothing is supposed to happen and everything is measured anyway. I'll describe a normal shift, because the normalcy matters. The horror, when it came, didn't replace the normal. It moved in alongside it. It used the normal as cover. I'd wake in the dark. There was no morning, not really, just the clock telling you it was time. I'd walk the enclosed corridor to the mess, the fluorescent tubes overhead buzzing in that flat institutional way, half of them flickering at a frequency you stopped noticing until your eyes ached. Coffee. Whatever Aoki had heated up. Petrova reading equipment logs at the table, not talking. Then the control room. The control room was the heart of it, a low-ceilinged space full of screens, the radar display sweeping its slow green arc, the bank of receivers murmuring static, the barometers and thermometers and humidity sensors all feeding their readings into a terminal that was older than I was. Every hour on the hour, I'd log the readings by hand into a paper book, then enter them into the system, then file the relevant ones up the chain on the comms link. Outside, through the small reinforced window, there was the antenna field and the snow and, at the edge of the floodlights, the first black trees. The wind was constant. I came to find it comforting, the way you find a refrigerator's hum comforting at night. It meant the world was still running. It meant things were normal. The sounds of the station became familiar. The generator's distant industrial drone, a low mechanical heartbeat you felt in the floor more than heard. The tick of the heating pipes. The radar's faint electronic pulse. And under it all, the wind, the wind, the wind. I logged temperatures that dropped past 40 below. I tracked storm systems rolling down off the pole, vast slow spirals of weather that I'd watched for days on the radar before they arrived, watched them hit, watched them pass. I relayed reports to a relay station I never saw, to people I only knew as voices and call signs. I maintained the equipment with Petrova, climbed the masts and harnessed to clear ice, my breath freezing on the inside of my mask. It was hard and it was lonely, and for a while it was fine. The first thing that wasn't fine was small. So small I almost didn't keep it. I was logging the overnight readings into the public record, transcribing from the paper book into the terminal, and I noticed a gap. In the paper book, in Dunmore's handwriting, there was a full set of readings for a storm that had come through 4 days before I arrived. Pressure, wind, temperature, the works. A significant system. The pressure had dropped hard, the kind of drop that gets a storm a name and a file and an entry in the regional record. But in the terminal, in the official log, those 4 hours didn't exist. Not blanked out. Not marked. Just gone, as if that block of time had been lifted clean out, the entries before and after stitched together so neatly you'd never notice unless you had the paper book open beside you. I assumed it was a transcription error. Somebody's mistake. I almost fixed it. I actually had my hands on the keys to enter the missing data, because that was my job, that was the whole point, the record was supposed to be complete. Petrova stopped me. She'd come in for the shift change and she was standing behind me, and I hadn't heard her, and she put one hand flat on the desk beside the keyboard. Not on my hand. Just near it. "Leave it," she said. "There's a gap. From before I got here. I was just going to. I know there's a gap." Her voice was level. Patient, even, in a way that was somehow worse than anger. "Don't fill it. Whatever's in the paper book that isn't in the terminal, that's a Class G. You leave it for Marsh. The card said Class G storms aren't logged publicly. It didn't say erase. It's the same thing," she said. "What goes in the book, Marsh decides what survives. The rest of us don't touch it." She looked at me then, properly, and there was something in her face I'd later learned to recognize on all of them. A tiredness that wasn't about sleep. "You're new. You're going to want everything to make sense and add up. It won't. The faster you stop needing it to, the easier this gets." I closed the entry without saving. The gap stayed a gap. That night, lying in my room, listening to the wind, I told myself it was bureaucracy. Classified weather. Military stuff, maybe, there's a lot of restricted airspace and restricted everything up there, and Class G sounded exactly like the kind of dull acronym a government would invent to bury something boring. That's what I told myself. It held up for about 3 weeks. I started watching the others after that. Not because I suspected anything specific. Just because there were 5 of us, and very little to do, and watching people is what you do when you're alone in the dark with them. Marsh almost never left his quarters except for meals and to handle whatever came up that the rest of us weren't allowed to. He had a private terminal in his office and a radio set on a frequency none of the rest of us used. Sometimes I'd pass his door and hear him talking on it, low, and the cadence was strange, not conversation, more like he was reading numbers, or responding to instructions. Once I heard him say, very clearly, "Confirmed. It's coming back early this year." And then nothing. Dunmore was the one I worried about. He was friendly in a frayed sort of way, talked too fast, never finished his food. He'd been at Kelvin 9 the longest after Marsh, 2 years, he said, though when I asked again later he said 3, and didn't notice he changed it. He had habits. Rituals, almost. He touched the doorframe twice before going through any exterior door. He kept the volume on the comms receivers turned up high, always, even the dead channels, so the static filled the room. I asked him why once and he said, "So I can hear if it stops." I didn't ask what it was. Aoki was the steadiest. He'd been there a year, and he'd made a kind of peace with the place that the others hadn't. He told me, over coffee, that the secret to the station was treating the rules like weather. "You don't argue with a storm," he said. "You don't ask the storm to explain itself. You just do the things that keep you alive until it passes. The rules are the same. Don't go in the woods. Don't log the G-storms. Stay in when it goes quiet. They're not mysteries you have to solve. They're just the conditions. Have you ever broken one?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Once," he said. "First month. I went toward the tree line. Just to look." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't push, but his hands had gone still around his cup, and after a while he said, "I don't remember walking back. That's all. I was at the fence, and then I was in my room, and 4 hours were gone, and Marsh had me on his card by then." He meant rule number 9. Memory discontinuity. "What did Marsh do?" Asked me what I remembered. I said nothing. He said good. Said the worst thing you can do is try to remember. Said the gaps are gaps for a reason, and if you go digging in them you find the digging looks back. Aoki shrugged, but it wasn't a casual shrug. I stopped going near the woods. That's the whole story. I want to be clear that none of this felt like horror in the moment. It felt like the strange folklore that grows up in any isolated workplace. The superstitions, the don't do this and watch out for that. Every remote crew has them. I'd worked a fishing boat one summer where men wouldn't whistle below deck. This felt like that. A little spookier, a little more formalized, but the same human thing. I held on to that interpretation as long as I could. It lasted until the first storm that didn't behave like weather. I'd been at Kelvin 9 about 5 weeks when I started keeping my own record. Not officially. Just a notebook, the kind I'd brought for crosswords. I started writing down the storms, every system, with its readings, its timing, whether it ended up in the public log or vanished into the gap. I told myself it was professional curiosity. The truth is something had started to itch in the back of my mind, a pattern half seen, and I've never been able to leave those alone. What I found, over the next few weeks, was this. The ordinary storms were ordinary. They built slowly. They announced themselves on the radar days out, came in off the pole or up from the interior, behaved exactly the way the physics said they should. Pressure dropped gradually. Wind backed and veered the way wind does. They were on the satellite imagery the relay station sometimes referenced. They were real, in the full, boring, verifiable sense. The Class G storms were different in ways I started to be able to predict before Marsh ever said the word. They didn't appear on the long-range radar until they were close. One moment the screen would be clear out to its full range, and the next sweep there'd be a return where there hadn't been one, already inside the range, as though it had simply switched on. The relay station never had them on satellite. I checked, carefully, asking oblique questions about cloud cover to the north, and the answers always came back clear skies, nothing showing, even as our own instruments were screaming about a system right on top of us. The pressure drops were wrong. Not in magnitude, in shape. A real storm's pressure trace is a curve, a smooth fall and rise. The G-storms dropped in steps. Flat, then a sudden cliff, then flat again, then another cliff. Pressure doesn't do that. Air doesn't do that. I showed one trace to Petrova once, the stepped line, and asked her what could cause it, what mechanism, and she looked at it for a long time and then she said, "It's not air pressure. It just registers on the same instrument." And she wouldn't say more. And the temperature. During a G-storm the temperature outside would drop, fast, the way it should in a strong system. But it would drop unevenly across the station. The thermometer on the north mast, facing the woods, would read 10, 15 degrees colder than the one on the south mast, 80 feet away. That's not possible. 80 feet doesn't hold a 15-degree gradient. Unless something was sitting in the woods, radiating cold, and the north mast was simply closer to it. I logged it all in my crossword notebook, and I kept the notebook in the lining of my mattress, and I didn't tell anyone, and I started to be afraid. The radio was the next thing. The comms at Kelvin 9 were old but solid, HF for long range, VHF for local, plus the scheduled link to the relay station. Dunmore ran them, but on the night shift they were mine, and I came to know their voices the way you know the voices of people you live with. The clean carrier of the relay station. The wash of static on the dead bands. The little chirps and pops of the atmosphere talking to itself. During ordinary weather, the radio was just the radio. During the G-storms, the radio did things. The first time, I thought I was tired. A G-storm was building. I knew the signs by then, the late radar return, the stepped pressure, and I was alone in the control room at maybe 2 in the morning, and on one of the dead HF bands, under the static, I heard a voice. Just at the edge of hearing. Male, I thought. Saying something with the rhythm of words but none of the substance, like speech heard through a wall, or through deep water. I turned up the gain. The voice got no clearer, but it got closer. I can't explain it better than that. The static stayed where it was, but the voice seemed to move forward through it, toward me, and as it came forward I started to be able to pick out individual sounds, and one of them was my name. Not my call sign. My name. My first name, the one I hadn't told anyone at the station, the one that wasn't on any record there. I turned the radio off. Just killed the power to the whole bank. And I sat in the sudden quiet, except it wasn't quiet, because the wind was still there, thank God, the wind was still scraping at the siding, and I sat there until my hands stopped shaking, and then I turned the receivers back on, and the band was just static, and the storm passed by morning, and Marsh logged it as AG, and it never existed. I asked Dunmore about it the next day. Carefully. I said, "Do the receivers ever pick up voices? During the bad storms?" He didn't look up from his thumbnail. "Don't answer it," he said. "Answer what?" "Whatever it sounds like. It'll sound like someone you should answer. That's how it works." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were doing too much, flicking around the room. Rule 3 says don't respond to external audio. People think that means stay quiet so it doesn't hear you. It's not that. It already knows you're here. The rule's so you don't say anything back. Because if you talk to it, it learns how you talk. And then it can use that. He bit down on his thumb. Don't answer it. Dunmore. What is it? It's the storm, he said, which wasn't an answer, and he wouldn't say anything else. The memory problem started around week 7. I want to describe these precisely because they're the part that's hardest to convey, and the part that frightens me most now, looking back, because they call everything else into question. Small things at first. I'd go to log the hourly reading and find it already logged, in my own handwriting. For a time I had no memory of being awake. I'd start a task and find it half finished by me, with no recollection of starting. I found a note on the control room desk in my own writing that said don't trust the south thermometer after dark, and I have no memory of writing it, and to this day I don't know what I meant or what I'd seen. Then a bigger one. I went to bed one night after an ordinary, calm shift, no storm, nothing on the radar, the wind steady. I remember lying down. The next thing I remember is standing in the corridor by the airlock, fully dressed in my outdoor gear, boots laced, mask on, my hand on the inner door of the airlock, and Aoki was holding my other arm, hard, and saying my name, and there was a smell of cold on me, the specific raw smell of having been outside. The clock said it was 4 hours later than when I'd gone to bed. Aoki walked me back to my room. He didn't ask me what I'd been doing. He said very quietly, "Did you go out?" "I don't know," I said, and it was the truth, and the truth was the worst thing I'd ever felt. "I don't remember anything. I was in bed and then I was here." "Aoki, I don't remember." "Good," he said, the same word Marsh had used. Don't try to. Report it to Marsh in the morning. He'll put you on the card. Don't try to remember, do you understand me? Whatever's in that gap, you leave it there. He stopped at my door. And check your boots in the morning. Don't check them now. In the morning, in the light. I didn't sleep. In the morning, in the gray light, I checked my boots. There was snow packed into the treads. The fine dry snow that only falls during a storm. But there had been no storm that night. The radar had been clear. The sky had been clear. The snow in my boots had come from somewhere it hadn't snowed. I reported to Marsh. He asked what I remembered. I said nothing. He said good, and wrote my name on a card, and asked me one more question, the same one from the interview, months ago and a lifetime ago. Do you lose track of time often? It started, I said, since I got here. He nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something he'd expected. It does that, he said. The place. The storms, mostly, but the place too. Time doesn't sit right out here. You'll find gaps. The job is to not fall into them. He looked older than he had 5 weeks ago. They all did. I wondered, with a lurch, whether I did too, and I realized I hadn't seen my own face in a mirror in days, because I'd started avoiding the mirror, and I couldn't remember deciding to. Marsh, I said. What's in the woods? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the only direct thing he ever said to me about it. We don't know, he said. That's the truth, and it's worse than if we did. We've been monitoring it for 40 years and we don't know what it is. We know it comes inside the storms. We know it's older than the station. We know if you go to it, it keeps you, and what comes back isn't all you. He turned back to his terminal. And we know that as long as we watch it and don't touch it and don't let it touch us, it stays in the woods. That's the whole job. We're not measuring weather. We're keeping watch. The weather's just what it travels in. The storm that should not have existed came in November, in the full dark, when there had been no real daylight for weeks. I knew it was wrong before any instrument did. I woke up because the wind had changed. Not stopped, changed. It had developed a rhythm. The constant scrape and hum of it had organized itself into something that pulsed slow, like breathing, like a vast slow tide of air moving in and out, and I lay in my bunk and counted it, and it was regular, regular as a heartbeat, regular as nothing in nature is regular. I went to the control room. Petrova was already there, and Dunmore, and that was wrong too, because it was the dead middle of the night, and there should only have been one person on shift. They were standing at the radar, not speaking, and on the radar there was nothing, the screen was clear, the sweep going round and round on empty. And then it wasn't. On the next sweep there was a return. A big one. Already close. Already inside the inner ring, which meant it was within 20 miles, which meant it had crossed 40 miles of open tundra between 2 sweeps of the radar, in 8 seconds, which is faster than anything moves, which is impossible. That's AG, Dunmore said, in a small, flat voice. That's not AG, Petrova said. Look at the size of it. Look at the return. She tapped the screen where the storm's echo was, and it was huge, and it was wrong. A normal storm shows as a ragged blotch, soft-edged, irregular. This return had structure. It had a shape. There was a denser core and lines radiating out from it, regular lines, like spokes, like a thing built rather than grown, and at the very center of it the radar showed nothing at all, a hole, a void where the energy went out and didn't come back. Marsh came in. He'd been awake. He looked at the radar for about 3 seconds and then he went to his private radio, and I heard him say, Kelvin 9 to control. We have an event. Repeat, we have an event. It's the big one. It's early. A pause. Static. Then a voice on the other end, thin and far away, and I couldn't hear what it said, but I heard Marsh's reply, and his reply was, Understood. Lockdown procedures. God help us. He turned to us. His face had gone very still, very calm, the calm of a man who has decided to be afraid later, if there is a later. Everyone listen. he said. Procedure from here. Aoki, full generator load, lock the fuel depot, then interior. Petrova, Dunmore, dead the exterior floodlights, all of them, then kill every transmitter, receive only. You. He pointed at me. Paper log only, no terminal, log everything by hand and do not, under any circumstances, send anything out. Nobody touches a transmit key. Nobody goes near an exterior door. We are dark and we are quiet and we wait. Why kill the lights? I asked. Because it's drawn to them, he said. And because we don't want to see it. The lights are off so we can't see it, and it can't see us. Move. We moved. The next hours were the worst of my life, and I remember them in fragments, the way you remember a fever. We killed the floodlights and the station went black on the outside, and the dark that pressed against the windows then was a dark with weight to it, a dark that seemed to lean. We shut down the transmitters and switched the receivers to listen only, and the static they put out was the only sound in the control room besides our breathing. The storm arrived. It didn't arrive like weather. Weather builds. This dropped on us all at once. One moment the wind was doing its slow breathing rhythm, and the next there was a sound like the sky tearing, and the snow came against the building horizontally, and the whole structure shuddered, and the temperature on the instruments fell off a cliff, not the stepped fall of a normal G, but a single plunge, 60 degrees in under a minute, down past anything the thermometers were built to read, the needles slamming against their stops. The pressure did something I still can't account for. It dropped, and then it stopped registering, the barometer simply giving up. The mercury vanished off the bottom of the scale as if the air outside had thinned to nothing, as if the storm were not a storm but a hole, a place where the atmosphere had been removed. My ears hurt. We were all swallowing, working our jaws, the pressure changed like a descent in a plane that didn't stop. And in the receivers, the static began to organize. It started as a texture in the noise, a roughness, and then a rhythm, the same slow breathing rhythm the wind had had, and then, under it, voices. Not one voice now. Many. A low murmuring crowd of them, all talking at once, in no language, and yet I kept almost understanding, kept catching the edge of a word, and every few moments one voice would surface out of the crowd and say something clear, and the clear things were always the same kind of thing. Open the door. It's so cold out here. Why did you turn off the lights? We can't find you. Let me in, it's me, you know it's me. And then, in Dunmore's voice, Dunmore's exact voice, while Dunmore stood right there beside me, white-faced and silent with both hands pressed over his own mouth, the radio said, "Don't worry. I already let it in." Dunmore made a sound I never want to hear again and lunged for the receiver, and Petrova caught him, both arms around him, and dragged him back, hissing in his ear. It's not you, that's not you, don't answer it, don't you dare answer it. Marsh hadn't moved. He was watching the window. The window was black. And he said, without turning around, in a voice that was almost gentle, "It's at the fence." I don't know how long the storm sat on us. The clocks disagreed afterward. The control room clock said 4 hours. My watch said 40 minutes. The paper log I kept by hand, which I have to this day, which is the only physical thing I took from that place, has entries in my handwriting that span 11 hours, with readings I have no memory of taking, in handwriting that gets worse and worse down the page until the last few entries aren't really words. What I remember is this. I remember that at some point the heavy step came again, the one from the cold open, the one I'll hear until I die, out past the antenna field, and then closer, a slow deliberate footfall that shook fine dust down from the ceiling tiles, each step nearer than the last, until it was just outside the wall, on the other side of 8 inches of insulated steel, and then it stopped. I remember the airlock. The outer door of the airlock had a small reinforced window, and there was a red indicator light beside it that showed when the outer door's seal was breached. We were all in the control room, all 5 of us, accounted for, nobody near the airlock. And the red light came on. Something had opened the outer door from the outside. And then there was a sound, in the corridor, of the inner door's handle being tried. Slowly. Patiently. Turned one way, then the other. Tested. Marsh had welded the inner door. I didn't know it at the time. He'd welded it shut himself. That first night I broke rule number 9 and walked toward it in my sleep. That was why Aoki had been there to catch me. Why Aoki checked my boots. After that night Marsh had welded the inner airlock doors shut, and we'd been using the secondary entrance. And I'd never asked why, because by then I'd learned not to ask. The handle turned, and the welds held, and after a while the turning stopped. I remember the voice that came last. After the crowd of voices on the radio had faded, after the wind had begun, finally, to climb back from its terrible rhythm towards something like ordinary chaos, there was one more transmission. Clear. Calm. In a voice I knew, a voice that made my chest seize because it was the voice of the man whose name I'd find later in the records, a comms operator named Halloran who'd worked the station the previous winter and who had, according to the file, departed by vehicle, March, not replaced. The same voice that had spoken in the cold open. The voice that called itself by a dead man's identity. It said, "You can let me in now. I'm so cold." And then, after a pause sounding almost sad, "You always let me in eventually. I'll wait." And then the static was just static, and the wind was just wind, howling and disordered and beautiful, and the storm was gone. The radar was clear out to full range. The pressure was climbing back to normal. The temperature was a survivable 40 below. Marsh sat down, heavily, in the chair by his private radio, and put his face in his hands, and the rest of us stood there in the dark not turning on the lights, and nobody said anything for a very long time. I found the records 2 days after the storm. I shouldn't have looked. Marsh had told me directly what was in the woods, or rather, that he didn't know what was in the woods, and that not knowing was the whole job. I should have left it there. But I had the itch, the pattern itch, and the storm had broken something in me, some last barrier between me and the need to know, even if knowing was the digging that looks back. The night after the storm, I couldn't sleep. The station was running on emergency power, half the systems still down. Marsh was in the infirmary. He'd had what Aoki called a spell, which I understood to mean his heart, and he was dosed and resting, and Petrova was watching him. Dunmore hadn't spoken since the storm. He sat in the comms room with the receivers turned all the way up, listening to the static, waiting, he said, to hear if it stopped. So nobody stopped me when I went into Marsh's office. His private terminal was locked, but the file cabinet wasn't. 40 years of a station that didn't officially exist had to keep its records somewhere, and they were there, in cheap olive drab folders, in a cabinet that smelled of cold metal and old paper. I read for 3 hours. I'm not going to pretend I understood all of it, or that what I understood adds up to an explanation. It doesn't. That's the point. That's the horror. 40 years of careful, methodical observation by serious people, and at the bottom of it, a hole where the answer should be. Here is what I learned. The station was built in the 1980s, but the woods predated it, and the records went back further than the station. There were transcribed field notes from a survey team in the 1950s, and references to Inupiat accounts older than that, accounts the survey team had dismissed and then, after a season, stopped dismissing. The local people had a word for the place. The notes rendered it phonetically and then, in a different hand, someone had translated it, the place where the cold thinks. They didn't go near it. They had gone near it, the notes said, in the deep past, and they had learned not to. The woods shouldn't exist. The survey team had confirmed that. Black spruce, that far north, in that soil, in that climate, impossible. The trees were there anyway. Core samples put some of them at over 1,000 years old, which was also impossible, and the cores showed growth rings that didn't track the climate, that recorded warm years in cold decades and cold years in warm ones, as if the trees were responding to a temperature that wasn't the air's. And the storms. 40 years of storms. The G-storms came, the records said, on no schedule that anyone had ever cracked, except that they came more often when the woods went silent first. The silence was the warning. The silence was the thing inhaling before it spoke. The big ones, the kind we just lived through, Those came every few years, and each one was logged, in full, in the secret record, and then scrubbed from every public database the station fed. Because, and this was the part that made the cold settle into me and never quite leave, the station's real job, the reason it was funded by an agency the folders never named, was concealment. They weren't only watching it. They were hiding it. Every satellite pass was scheduled around the G-storms. Every regional weather model was quietly corrected to erase them. 40 years of making sure that whatever lived in those woods, and traveled in those storms, never showed up on a single screen anywhere in the world, so that nobody would ever come looking, so that nobody would ever come and let it in. Because it wanted in. That was the thing the record circled and never said plainly. It didn't attack. It didn't break the doors, though the records suggested it could. It asked. It used voices. It used the voices of the dead and the absent, and worse, it used the voices of people who were still alive, still in the room. It learned how you spoke and then it spoke as you, and it asked to be let in, and it waited, because it had all the time there was, and the records were full of names. The names were the worst part. A roster, going back 40 years. Crew after crew, 3 or 4 or 5 names at a time, with dates of arrival and dates of departure. And next to a great many of the names, instead of a departure date, there was a notation, the same notation, in different hands across the decades. Walked out during a G event. Not recovered. And next to a smaller number of names, a different notation, one I read over and over trying to make it mean something other than what it meant. Returned. Not all returned. I understood then what Marsh had said. If you go to it, it keeps you, and what comes back isn't all you. The roster had a column for it. There was a whole column for it. Halloran, the voice from the radio, the man who'd departed by vehicle. His real notation, in Marsh's handwriting, was, returned March. Not all returned. Departed by request. Departed by request. Marsh had sent him away, or let him go, or, I didn't want to think about the other possibilities. And then I found my own name. It was at the bottom of the current roster, where it should have been, with my arrival date. But the departure column wasn't blank. Someone had made a notation already, in pencil, faint, in handwriting I didn't recognize except that I did recognize it, because it was mine, it was my own handwriting, and it said, walked out during a G event. With a date. The date was 11 days in the future. I put the folders back. I closed the cabinet. I went and stood in the corridor by the welded airlock for a long time, looking at the door I had apparently already decided to walk through on a date that hadn't happened yet, and I tried to understand how my own handwriting could be on a record about my own future, and I couldn't, and I made myself stop trying, because trying to understand it was the digging, and the digging looks back. I want to tell you that I went to Marsh, or Petrova, that I confronted someone, that there was a scene. There wasn't. By that point I understood the station too well. There was nothing to confront. There was no villain. There were 5 exhausted people keeping a 40-year vigil over something none of them understood, doing the small procedural things that kept them alive. One more storm, one more silence, one more season. The horror at Kelvin 9 wasn't a monster you could fight. It was a condition. It was the weather. You don't argue with a storm. What I did was talk to Petrova. I found her in the infirmary, watching Marsh sleep. I sat down beside her and I said quietly, I read the records. She didn't get angry. She just closed her eyes for a moment, like someone receiving news they'd expected. Then you saw your name, she said. It was in my handwriting. The date's in 11 days. I know. Marsh saw it last week. That's why he welded the door. She opened her eyes and looked at me, and there was something terrible and kind in it. Everybody's name shows up early, eventually. Mine's there too. Has a date. The date's passed. I'm still here. She almost smiled. So it's not certain. That's the thing I need you to understand. It writes the names. It writes them in your own hand, while you sleep, while you're in a gap. It puts your own hand to it. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. But writing it isn't the same as it happening. It writes what it wants. The rules are what stop it. As long as you keep the rules, the date passes, and the name stays just ink. And if you break a rule? She looked back at Marsh. Then the ink comes true, she said. That's all the rules are. That's all they've ever been. They're not superstition. They're the difference between a name and a death. She was quiet, then she said, Dunmore's been breaking them. Little ones. He's been answering the radio. I've caught him twice. His date's in 3 weeks and he's been answering, and I can't make him stop. Her voice didn't break, but something behind it did. He's not going to make it. I've watched it before. Once they start answering, they don't stop, because it sounds like the only person who understands them, out here in all this nothing. It learns exactly what you need to hear. And then one night the woods go silent, and they walk out to the only voice that ever really listened. I asked her the question I'd been carrying since the cold open, since the first silence, the one nobody had ever quite answered. What is it, Petrova? Really? What's in the woods? And she gave me the only answer anyone ever gave me that felt completely true. I don't know, she said. I've been here 9 years and I don't know, and I've stopped needing to. It's old. It's cold. It's lonely in a way that's worse than any loneliness we've got a word for, and it has been alone out there in those trees for longer than there have been people to be alone from. And it wants company. That's all I'm sure of. It is so lonely, and it wants someone to come and be with it, forever, in the cold, in the dark, in the quiet. She looked at me. And the awful thing, the thing that gets people, is that after a few months out here, in our dark and our quiet and our cold, you start to understand exactly how it feels. You start to feel like it. And that's when it knows it can use your voice. Because it isn't lying when it says it's cold, and it wants to come in. It's just no longer sure whether it's saying it, or you are. Dunmore walked out 9 days later. The woods went silent at 3:50 in the morning. I know because I was on shift, and I felt the wind stop, felt the pressure shift in my ears, felt that vast underwater stillness drop over the station, and I did exactly what rule number 3 says. I stayed where I was. I didn't go to the window. I didn't answer the radio, though it spoke, though it used voices, though at one point it used Petrova's voice and said she'd fallen on the ice outside and needed help, and I sat on my hands and I did not move and I did not answer, and I have to live with the fact that I'll never be completely sure it wasn't really her. It wasn't. She was in her quarters. She's still alive, as far as I know. But for about 90 seconds I had to decide to believe she might be dying outside and do nothing, because the rule said do nothing, and the rule is the difference between a name and a death. Dunmore answered. We found his comms room empty when the wind came back. The receivers were still on, turned all the way up, hissing static. The secondary door's breech light was lit. There were tracks in the fresh snow, leading away from the station, across the antenna field to the fence, through the gap in the fence where the maintenance gate stood open, and on, in a straight unhurried line, into the black wall of the trees. The tracks didn't wander. That's what I remember. A man walking out into 60 below dark in the middle of an event, and his tracks went perfectly straight, like he was walking towards something he could see clearly, like he was finally going to meet someone he'd been talking to for a long time. Marsh didn't send anyone after him. There's a rule about that too, rule number 11, the last one on the card, the one I hadn't understood until that morning. Do not pursue personnel who exit during an event. Recovery is not possible. Log and seal. We logged it. Walked out during a G event. Not recovered. In Marsh's handwriting, because Marsh insisted on writing the bad ones himself, said it was the one thing he could still do for them, write it down in a steady hand so the record was at least honest. And then Marsh scrubbed the storm from the public log, and the storm had never happened, and Dunmore had never been there, and 40 miles of clear sky stretched north on every satellite in orbit. My date came 4 days after that. I don't remember the night it was supposed to happen. That's the truth, and I've made my peace with the fact that it's the kind of truth that should frighten you. I remember going to bed. I remember the wind was steady. I remember nothing else until I woke in my own bunk, in the morning gray, with the date already passed, my name in the roster still just ink, and snow packed in the treads of my boots that were sitting by the door where I never leave them. So I went somewhere. The night of my date, I went outside, in my sleep, in a gap, the way I'd nearly done before. And something, the welds, the rules, Petrova checking on me, dumb luck, I'll never know, something turned me back at the fence, or before the fence, and the ink stayed ink, and I came back, all of me, I think. That's the thing I can't give you. The clean ending. I survived Kelvin 9. I finished my 3 months. They flew me out in December and I never went back, and 4 months after that they closed the station, pulled the equipment, sealed the buildings, and erased it from the maps it was never really on, and I don't know why they closed it, and I've stopped asking, because asking is digging, and the digging looks back. But I survived it the way the records meant when they wrote returned, not all returned. I came back, and most of me came back, and I have spent every year since trying to figure out which part didn't. Because here is what I'm left with. I still hear the wind stop. In a quiet house, in a city 1,000 miles south, in the middle of an ordinary night, sometimes the world goes silent, really silent, the hell-breath silence, the underwater stillness, and my ears pop with a pressure change that isn't there, and for a few seconds I am back in that control room at 4:12 in the morning with my pen on the paper and a heavy step coming closer through trees that shouldn't exist. And sometimes, in that silence, very faint, from somewhere that isn't anywhere, I hear a voice. It's calm. It's patient. It uses a voice I know. Last week it used mine. It said it was cold. It said it had been waiting. It said I always let it in, eventually. And the terrible thing, the thing that gets people, the thing Petrova warned me about in the infirmary with her dead colleague sleeping beside her, the terrible thing is that I'm no longer completely sure. When I hear that voice say it's lonely and it's cold, and it wants to come in from the dark, I'm no longer completely sure whether it's saying it, or whether I am. I keep the rules anyway. All of them, even down here where they make no sense. When the world goes silent, I stay where I am. I don't go to the window. I don't answer. And I wait for the wind to come back. It always comes back. So far.